Hey guys, welcome to our podcast, the KJK. You will have Carla, Getsamani, and Kylie speaking today. Let's dive in. The BTK Killer. That's who we'll be talking about today. We'll mention a little bit about him and his murders, but our main focus is to talk about the mistakes or errors made by the police in catching the BTK Killer and how these cases became a benchmark in forensic science. So the BTK Killer was a named man, Dennis Rader. BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill, which is what he did to his victims. What's interesting is that he gave himself that name because he wanted to be known and recognized for his killings. Dennis Rader killed 10 people that we know of from 1974 to 1991, and between 1974 to 1976, he stopped killing due to raising his newborn son and going to school. Even though he didn't kill anyone during this time period, the stalking of individuals would not stop. Dennis Rader would stalk his victims before killing them. Now, warning, guys, we will talk about how he committed these murders. Rader would usually stalk his victims, then go into their house and cut their phone cord lines so that they wouldn't be able to call for help, and then he would bind or tie his victims' bodies with whatever he could find, which was rope or pantyhose or anything like that. Then he would strangle these individuals or stab them until they stopped breathing, and then they would die. If anyone got in his way, he would shoot them. He got this sexual satisfaction of binding, torturing, and killing his victims. He wouldn't rape his victims, but there were times where he would masturbate alongside their dead body, which is the semen that the police would find at the crime scene. What's interesting is how he grew up. No research shows that he had any traumatic experiences in his childhood, only that he was supposedly dropped on the head as a kid. They also found that he was born with a defective thalamus that caused him to have no emotion. He eventually began to strangle local cats and dogs in his childhood. What is strange is how he was able to function normally in life, like kids, marriage, work, school, which is strange because that's something a lot of serial killers cannot do. On August 18, 2005, the BTK Killer was sentenced to a maximum prison sentence of 175 years to life in prison, which equals to 10 consecutive life sentences for the 10 people he killed, and he will not be eligible for parole until 2180. Now, let's move on to the main focus of our talk today, which are the errors made in trying to solve these murders, and how from these murder cases it helped in advancing forensic science and what they do to solve cases today.
Okay, so let's talk about the errors first. One of the biggest mistakes the police made was to assume that the BTK killer was dead. They had stopped investigating the murders due to a long time in between them. They arrested many innocent people for the murders the killer committed. He had interactions with the cops. For instance, he had written a letter confirming they had not come yet, and that he did everything himself with no one's help, insinuating they had innocent people locked up for the murders he had done. He had another encounter with the cops after murdering Nancy Fox. He had called from a telephone booth telling them they will find a homicide at her home, which makes me wonder, did the police swab for DNA in that telephone booth? Meanwhile, the BTK killer had contact with the police. They had decided not to let anyone find out there was a serial killer on the loose to not cause panic within the community. There was another incident where it was questionable whether the police were being ethical. This was when police collected DNA from Vicky's fingernails, who was strangled but did not die until the hospital. The police collected DNA from hundreds of men in Wichita, making over 1,300 samples of DNA in hopes of finding the DNA of the BTK killer. But none were a match, and after that they were destroyed after finding out there was no matches. I found it interesting how the cops suspected the BTK killer was connected to Wichita State. The letter they received was traced to a photocopier used by a student, and the letter was patterned after an obscure ballad taught in a folklore college workshop. They did not choose to further investigate this theory. Maybe they would have found out that former student Dennis Rader was the infamous BTK killer. All the waiting and no further investigation in the murderers' cases caused the long period of catching Dennis Rader, the BTK killer.
The BTK case was extremely important to the forensic science community because it had displayed a strong use of computer forensics that led to his timely arrest. Prior to the discovery of his identity, Dennis Rader taunted police by making phone calls, writing letters and word puzzles, and sending in photos of crime scenes and the ID of one of his victims. However, his final mistake was the submission of a floppy disk that police used to recover valuable information through old documents that Rader thought he had destroyed. These documents contained incriminating evidence that linked Dennis Rader to the Christ Lutheran Church and identified him as being the last user. At the time, Rader was the president of the church council, and forensic specialists were able to trace these documents back to his church computer through the disk's metadata. The recovered documents included information about his location, places where he had previously worked, and even his first name. The use of digital forensics along with DNA analysis ultimately brought Rader down. He left behind a multitude of evidence at his crime scenes, including semen and remnants underneath the fingernail of one of his victims. At the time of his earliest murders, DNA evidence was not used to identify criminals in crime scene investigations. However, it had become a more popular practice by the time of his arrest, which led investigators to link him to his previous crimes. To collect samples for testing, law enforcement acquired a search warrant that allowed them to obtain DNA evidence collected from his daughter's pap smears. The results confirmed that she was genetically related to the person that committed the crimes, establishing that she was the daughter of the BTK Killer. However, though DNA evidence was important in this case, its greatest attribution to the forensic science field was its use of digital forensics. The BTK case was the beginning of the modern age of digital forensics and arguably set the standard for the many cases that followed. This case emphasized the significance of a digital trail and is considered one of the most famous cases solved by computer forensics to date.